Hello! I'm Jenny Fern and welcome to my library. I'm a chaotic neutral mechanical engineer who's really into permaculture and I like to talk about books. So let's talk about books. Today I want to talk about the classics that I read in 2023. Sans one book, this is all of them. I just kind of want to talk about them. I'm gonna zoom this in a little bit so that we get a little bit more personal. I just wanted to be able to show the books. These are the books. So we should be a little bit more intimate over here. I'm gonna go through these initially in the order in which I read them during the year. First we have Charlotte's Web, first published in 1952. This is a children's classic about a little pig who is on a farm, befriended by a very loving, nice spider. And there's also this girl named Fern involved. But it really is mostly about the relationship between the pig and the spider. Oh, this book just makes me cry. I love it, and I love their relationship. The next book that I read was Little Town on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This was first published in 1941. It's when the family, they're more like teenage, maybe like more young women than they are children, and they're starting to like get involved in dating and like going out on the town. They do these like very intellectual get-togethers, which I'd never known about before. Then I went to the beginning of the series with Little House in the Big Woods, also by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This was first published in 1932. I have such a soft spot for this book because of how much it influenced my childhood writing style. When I first read it, I think in the 3rd grade, rereading it was pretty interesting. It's very simple. It's a very simple little book. The next book that I have, I don't actually have because I've loaned it out to a friend, and that is Walls and Bars by Eugene V. Debs. That was published in 1927, and it was written by the socialist candidate for presidency a couple times. He was in prison and he was writing about his experience being in prison. He was actually nominated for president while he was in prison. I really loved it. The next book that I have, I don't know if it's actually considered a classic because it's a little obscure, but it was published in 1946 and it did get a Newbery Award. That's Miss Hickory by Carolyn Sherwin Bailey. I read this when I was a child. It was a library discard. Couldn't remember the name of this book for such a long time. It was just itching at my brain that I had to get it and reread it. So I reread it this year. It's a weird little story. It's about it's like this little twig doll with a hickory nut head, and she is kind of abandoned by her family. Her child leaves her behind while they go away, and she kind of fends for herself during the winter, and it follows the seasons and how she kind of survives. Super weird. Then we have John Barleycorn, The Alcoholic Memoirs of Jack London. This was first published in 1913. And it follows Jack London, the famous author, and his thoughts and recollections regarding alcohol and his alcoholism. This was a book written to help promote the prohibition of alcohol. Surprisingly, really enjoyed this. Then I read Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. This was first published in 1922. I have wanted to read this for such a long time because I love the cover. I love the font. I love how this book looks. I love the title. And I think it was when I was doing my AP Lit test, there was an excerpt from Babbitt, and I was like, one day I'm gonna read this book. And I did, and I really enjoyed it. It's about this man. He's just such an interesting case. It's a study of this man, Babbitt. On the back of the book, it says, one of the ugliest but most convincing figures in American fiction, the total conformist. I thought it was so interesting how this looks at American cities and towns and the concepts around what they should be like. Then I read The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. This was first published in 1926, and it follows some young folks who are kind of meandering listlessly throughout Europe drinking, partying, and seeing the sights. I don't know, I didn't really connect that much with this one, but it was fine, and I'm sure it is generally important for capturing the feelings of the day. Then I read The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells, and I had tried to read this book when I was in high school, I believe. It might have been earlier than that, and I didn't read very much and I hated it. I thought it was so boring. And then when I reread it this year, well, I only got to like, I don't know, page 20 or something when I was younger. When I read it this year, it was genuinely so funny. It felt so modern. The Invisible Man himself is just kind of like a jerk, and it's explores like, if you give this kind of guy this power, what is he gonna do with it? I thought it was such a compelling story and character, but not maybe what I expected, I suppose. And this was written in 1897. Really felt quite a bit more modern than that. Then I read Farmer Boy, also by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This follows the story of Almanzo Wilder, who is the man that Laura Ingalls goes on to marry. So it follows him and his story. He works on a farm and he works with horses a lot. It was all right. That was first published in 1933. Then I read Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. This was first published in 1886, and I actually read this as a LibriVox audiobook. I tried to read along with this text as well, but this is abridged. It's kind of like a young adult novel, honestly. It follows a young boy. I don't know how to describe this. It's a ride. It's really action-packed, but I'm having a hard time putting words to what the actual plot was. Next up, On the Banks of Plum Creek by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This was first published in 1937. This follows the family when they have moved to this new property where they're gonna farm, and there's like this dugout here. I really enjoyed the first part of this book, but then the latter half kind of fell off for me. Up next, another Little House on the Prairie book that is By the Shores of Silver Lake. This was published in 1939. And it follows the family when they're at yet another location. They're by the shores of Silver Lake. I'm having a hard time parsing out the books at this point because I read them so closely together, but I feel like this one was okay. Next up, I read White Fang by Jack London. I thought this was really, really well written. It follows 2 generations of like wolf dogs in Alaska. There is the initial she-wolf, then there's her son, White Fang. Kind of explores the world of like wild Alaska through the lens of both these wolf dogs and also the humans that are associated with them. So it's kind of an interesting perspective and story told through both the natural world and the human world. I thought it was really, really well done, but I didn't really super connect with the story that was told. I mean, I connected with it. It like almost made me cry, but I didn't love it. Then I read Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. I love Jules Verne, and I quite enjoyed Journey to the Center of the Earth. I did not read this translation, this copy of it. I also read this as a LibriVox copy. It is one of those exploration stories that are common in this era of writing that have to do with some kind of eccentric professor or something who wants to research a topic. So in this case, they end up going into the earth and exploring like the recesses. I quite enjoyed it. And this was first published in 1864. And then I read Around the World in 80 Days. This book is so silly. This is also by Jules Verne, and this was published in 1872. This is more of like a pulpy page-turnery. It's just got like goofs in it. We're following this eccentric guy who is out to prove that he can travel around the world in 80 days using the various like train systems and locomotion systems that existed at that time. It's really like a logistics book. There's like these hijinks as well along the way. The next book that I read was The Long Winter, and I think out of all of the Little House on the Prairie books that I read this year, I think this one was the most compelling to me. I have lived in California my whole life, basically, and I've never experienced the type of cold that these people experienced. And I can't imagine experiencing this in the era in which they lived. It was genuinely difficult to keep yourself alive during those types of blizzards. It was really interesting to hear about how people lived in that time in those conditions. This was published in 1940. So for this video, I had a cutoff for like classics as anything that was before 1970. And then anything that I thought was like a little bit niche, I would say I'm not sure if this is a classic, right? So in this case, this is one of the more recent classics that I have in this list, and that's The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. And this was published in 1967. To be completely honest, I didn't realize that this book was that old. I could be convinced that this was from like, honestly, the 1990s. So I'm a little surprised that this is from the 1960s. I think this is a children's story, right? This follows the story of a little unicorn in this fantasy world, and it's very magical, very fantastical, very storybook. I will admit I had a really hard time reading this. My brain was not really working with me at the time, so I think I got quite lost and confused, and I didn't connect with the way that this story was being told and the words that were being used, but I could recognize that it was a beautiful story and that I was just having a hard time with it. So this is one that I would really need to reread in order to give like a real full explanation of my feelings on it. I'm pretty sure it was me and not the book. I'm pretty sure. This book has a huge asterisk because I don't think anybody considers this a classic, because I don't think anybody's read this book. It's called The Ways of a Mud Dauber. I don't have the dust jacket. I got this at a thrift store, and this is my favorite book from this entire year. I loved it so much. It is from 1949, and it is written by George D. Schaefer. It follows some scientific research by the author on these wasps at the Stanford campus. Oh my god, I loved it so much. Here's the cover I'll use, since the cover is missing. I don't know how many copies of this are available in the world right now, but if you can pick a copy of this up, do, because it's so good. If you're interested in insects, in the scientific method, in being like a scientist, or like a citizen scientist, I feel like this would be really up your alley. I don't know, it was just such the perfect book for me. It's also very human, which I appreciate. Then I read another Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea. This one was written significantly later than The Sun Also Rises. This was written in 1952, and it's a novella about this Cuban man who is a fisherman, and he catches like this gigantic fish, and it explores just the few days before and during this experience of his lifetime, I suppose. I loved the characters. I loved how the story was told. I really, really enjoyed this book. I thought it was so, so good. I really highly recommend this to people. I think people will enjoy this. Then we have some Ray Bradbury. This is The Illustrated Man, published in 1951. I feel like that's early. I just never associate Bradbury with the 1950s. I don't know why I thought he was like more modern than that. This is a short story collection of some of Bradbury's works. To me, they don't really have a common theme. Sci-fi-y, Bradbury-y. If you are into his work, which I don't know why you wouldn't be, because he's an excellent author. I really enjoyed this. I reread The Little Prince this year. Just such a wonderful book. It transcends genre, kind of like a little children's picture book, but it's also such an existential work of fiction that is so excellent for anyone of any age, and that you can get so much out of it with every time you read it. I so enjoyed the experience of rereading this book. This is from 1943. I'm not 100% sure that this is a classic, but it's from 1969, so this is the most modern classic I have, and it is written in such an archaic way, which is funny to me. This is Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth by R. Buckminster Fuller. This is nonfiction, and it's kind of like just his thoughts and ideas about the Earth, sustainability, the direction that we're going, the mistakes that we're making in terms of like how we look at our role, our approach to civilization at the moment of writing this book, and our approach to the Earth's resources. Very, very weird read. Had a hard time reading it, but also found it so interesting, so compelling. Then I read yet another H.G. Wells. This is The Island of Dr. Moreau. This is a novella about a man who is on this island with this crazy doctor who is turning animals into human-like creatures with human-like intelligences, enslaved and in pain. It is a wild ride. It was one of the coolest discussions and explorations into humanity and what it means to be human and concepts of pain and intelligence, while also being super entertaining and action-packed and having like a really readable story. This is from 1896 and it has no business being this good. Then I reread Frankenstein, and this is another one of those books that I just had a really hard time with my experience reading it this year, similar to my experience with The Last Unicorn. I just had a really hard time following and connecting with this book. Again, I think in this case, I honestly think it is about half me and half the book, because the book has a really weird structure. It's from 1818. Then I read The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Chester. This is a reread. I absolutely adore this book. This is a middle grade fiction. It explores the concepts of math and English, the idea of being a young boy who isn't really interested in going to school or learning in general, who's kind of like disillusioned with the concept of learning. And it puts him into this magical world akin to the world of Oz or Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. It is such a joy to read. There's so many silly little jokes in here. This is from 1961. It is timeless. It's perfect. I just finished reading this book. This might be the last classic that I read this year, but I'm not 100% sure because I also have another Hemingway checked out from the library right now. But this is Cheaper by the Dozen by Frank B. Gilbreth Jr. and Ernestine Gilbreth Carey. This follows the Gilbreth family who have 12 children, which is why it's Cheaper by the Dozen. Their parents are really interested in motion study and kind of like productivity in terms of like assembly line kind of processes. And they use their family as a way of studying motion study. There's all of these ways of like doing things in the most efficient way. Like there's this chapter where the father is teaching all of his children to type. The way he goes about them learning how to type is pretty interesting to me. There's also an instance where a bunch of the kids need to get their tonsils removed, and so they use that as a way of looking at the motion study of removing tonsils. So there's this whole aspect of this book based on the parents' profession that I wasn't expecting to get because I didn't have any expectations going into this book. This is kind of similar to the Little House on the Prairie books in terms of it is written by the children of the family and it is about their experiences in the family. So it has that like retrospective and nostalgic fondness for the past. Did I say this was written in 1948? Now that we've covered these books here, I think maybe I'll just do a blurb about classics in general. So I think sometimes the classics get a bad rap because there's an idea that they're really convoluted language, that they're irrelevant subjects, that they're not that interesting, or that they're way too smart. And in my opinion, that's just not the case. I think in my opinion, the three most unapproachable books were Frankenstein, The Last Unicorn, and Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. But otherwise, these all read simply enough. So I already mentioned when reviewing each individual book how much I liked each one. But I want to go through and show you just some excellent books that I think will be approachable for people in general. So Charlotte's Web, such a wonderful classic. It's written for children, so it's generally not going to be that hard to read. There's also John Barleycorn. This is written in a very conversational way because it's about Jack London's life. His life is so interesting that I think people will find it compelling even though it is from the early 1900s. The Old Man and the Sea. This is just such a riveting tale. Ernest Hemingway is an excellent author. His use of words is very well thought out. The Phantom Tollbooth. Again, this is written for children, so it's going to be not that hard. It's just such a fun story. The Little Prince. I think this book is good for everybody, and again, it's written for children, so the language is very simple. It also has pictures. And The Island of Dr. Moreau. This one might be a little bit harder to get into because we start on a ship. In my opinion, classics that start on a ship are usually a little bit harder to get into because there's all that ship language. Once you get into the meat of the story on the island, this is going to be such an interesting adventure that you're going to fly through it. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this inspires you to get interested in reading some classics. They're not that scary. They're just regular books. You're gonna have a wonderful time. Thank you so much for watching. If you have a classic that I didn't recommend in this video that you think people need to read, please leave it in the comments. Okay, thanks, bye!